Ladies and gentlemen, there is an idea, ancient, unrelenting and terrifying in its implications, that God is not seeking the perfect. He is not gathering the pristine or the unblemished. God is looking for sinners. That phrase alone should stop you cold. Because what does it mean? It means that perfection was never the prerequisite. It means your shame, your guilt, your brokenness, they don't disqualify you, they're the very reason He's calling your name. We've created a culture that pretends virtue comes from image, that cleanliness comes from display, and that salvation belongs only to the respectable. That is a lie, a profound lie, because redemption by definition can only come to those who need to be redeemed. Core message: you may have failed, perhaps catastrophically. You may be drowning in secrecy, haunted by memories, collapsing under the weight of who you are not, and still God is looking for you. Not the version of you wish you were, not the facade you show the world, you. You see, God doesn't call the righteous to repent, because the righteous have already sealed off their souls from grace. The sinner, broken, desperate, afraid, is open to transformation, and in that openness is sacred potential. There's a paradox here. We think we must fix ourselves before we can approach something holy, but that's not how it works. You approach the holy, and then you're transformed. The church, the real church, not the polished institution but the spiritual body, is not a museum of saints. It is a hospital for the wounded, a battlefield triage for souls, deeper reflection. But here's the problem: most people don't want to be seen as sinners, they want to be admired, they want to win in the eyes of others, and that's precisely why they don't change. Because pride locks the door. Pride says, I'm fine, but God says you're dying, and I want to heal you. So ask yourself, what part of you are you hiding? What skeleton is buried beneath your success, your strength, your smile? That is the place God is aiming for, not to shame you, but to restore you. And when you accept that, when you allow yourself to stand trembling and undone, before a power beyond comprehension, you become something more than moral, you become transformed. The idea that God seeks the broken and not the perfect is not only a theological claim, it's a psychological axiom. It cuts to the heart of how transformation, healing and redemption actually work. You don't fix what isn't broken, you don't heal what isn't sick, and you certainly don't redeem what's already pure. So when you look at the spiritual framework of the world, you find an astonishing truth: the very people we tend to discard, dismiss or judge, those are the ones God moves toward, those are the people He is calling. We live in a time obsessed with performance. We showcase our lives, we carefully curate who we appear to be, our social media is sanitized, our relationships are transactional, and our pain is hidden behind glass. Everyone is trying to look good, act fine, and seem in control, but underneath all that polish is despair. And the terrifying thing is this: the more perfect you try to appear, the more distant you become from your own soul, and from God Himself. Because God doesn't deal in masks, He doesn't heal illusions, He deals with what is real, and what is real, more often than not, is bruised and messy and flawed. The person who cries in the dark, the one who screams into silence, the one who carries guilt so heavy it eats away at their identity, that's the person God is looking for, not because their brokenness is noble in itself, but because it's honest, and where there is honesty, there is room for grace. We confuse cleanliness with worthiness. We think God is attracted to purity, like a magnet to steel, but that's not the narrative we see in sacred history. God chooses murderers, adulterers, cowards, doubters. He chooses the addict, the liar, the outcast. Why? Because the perfect person has no need for redemption, they have no hunger for change, their cup is already full, at least in their own eyes. But the broken are thirsty, and God meets thirst with living water. There is profound psychological truth in this. If you think you're perfect or close to it, you're blind, you're cut off from the chaos inside of you, and when you're cut off from that chaos, you become fragile, easily threatened, easily offended. You build your identity on a false self, and any confrontation with your weakness becomes an existential threat. But when you accept your brokenness, when you confront it, name it, bring it into the light, you become strong in a new way, not because you're flawless, but because you're rooted in reality. That's where God meets you in reality. Most people run from their wounds, they deny their addictions, they rationalize their cruelty, they bury their shame, but the wounds don't disappear, they rot, they infect the soul, they manifest in relationships, in habits, in sleepless nights, and they whisper, constantly, "You're not enough." That voice, the one that tells you you're unworthy, is the very reason people keep hiding. But here's the paradox. God already knows. He knows exactly where you're bleeding. He knows the lies you tell, the pain you carry, the things you regret so deeply you can't speak them aloud. And still, He calls you, not despite those things, but because of them, because it's in that recognition of your own moral failing, your own inner chaos, that the door opens. That's where you start to change, not by denying your darkness, but by walking straight into it with God beside you. That's how you become a person worth becoming. And if you refuse that path, if you cling to your image, your pride, your false perfection, you stay stuck, you rot beneath the surface. You can perform goodness, but you'll never be transformed by it. The spiritually transformative journey begins with a kind of death, the death of your ego, the death of your pretense, and that death only happens when you admit you're broken. That's why God is looking for sinners, not saints, because sinners are the only ones humble enough to change, the only ones honest enough to face who they are. And it's in that facing, in that brutal self-confrontation, that something truly miraculous can occur, not self-improvement, not moral superiority, but rebirth. So if you feel unworthy, if you feel like a fraud, like a failure, like someone who has gone too far or lost too much, understand this: you are closer to grace than the one who thinks they have no need of it. Because God is not drawn to perfection, He is drawn to the truth. And the truth is, every single one of us is broken, only some are brave enough to admit it. Shame and guilt, these two forces can grip a human being by the throat. They linger, they twist, they become internal judges, whispering with unrelenting voices, "You're not good enough, you've gone too far, you've ruined everything." And it's easy to believe those voices, it's easy to mistake them for truth, because shame doesn't shout, it doesn't need to. It creeps in slowly, attaching itself to memory, to failure, to identity, and over time, a person doesn't just feel ashamed, they become ashamed. It defines them. But here's the truth, and it's a hard one for many to accept: shame and guilt do not disqualify you. In fact, they may be the very things that prove you are ready to be changed. It is a tragedy that so many people walk around imprisoned by a past they cannot undo. They carry it like a secret weight, believing that if anyone knew what they had done, or what had been done to them, they would be cast out, judged or exposed. And so they hide. They build lives around avoidance, around image management, but the wound remains. And worse, they believe that because of their past, they're beyond redemption. They believe they forfeited grace. But that belief is a lie, an insidious one, because guilt is not the end, it's the beginning. Shame is not a sentence, it's a signal. These emotions exist not to destroy us, but to wake us up. When you feel guilt, when you feel shame, you are acknowledging that there is a standard you have failed to meet. That's not weakness, that's awareness, that's the conscience doing its sacred work. It means you still care, it means you're still morally alive. The danger isn't in feeling guilt, the danger is in becoming numb to it, in rationalizing it away, in burying it so deep that you can't feel it anymore. That's the true path to destruction. The real courage, the terrifying kind, comes when you turn and face that guilt, when you stop running from the thing that haunts you, and walk straight into it with your eyes wide open. That moment, when you name your failure without excuse, without justification, without spinning it for the comfort of others, that's the moment transformation becomes possible. That's when grace is not just a concept, but a force that can enter your life. Because grace doesn't land on those who pretend to be perfect, it floods into those who know they're not, and are still willing to keep walking. Many people believe they must be clean before they approach the divine, that they must be pure before they seek forgiveness. But it's the other way around. You bring your mess, your sins, your regrets, and your shame to God, and that's the very place where the healing begins. Not before, right there, in the dirt, in the moment you believe you're unworthy. That's when you're the most ready to be embraced. Because now finally, your pride has been shattered, and pride is the real enemy here, not failure, not sin. Pride is the thing that keeps you locked in isolation, unwilling to admit weakness, unwilling to confess, unwilling to cry out for help. If shame has a voice, it says you are unlovable, because of what you did. If guilt speaks, It says you should have known better, so now you deserve nothing. But the voice of grace speaks louder. If you're willing to listen, it says, you are still mine. It says I knew what you'd do, and I still chose you. It says your worst moment doesn't get the final word. That's not sentimentality. That's not spiritual sugarcoating. That's the radical nature of forgiveness, and it demands something from you. Honesty, not performance, not polished perfection, just honesty. There are people walking around every day as ghosts of themselves, not because they can't be forgiven, but because they won't let themselves be. They think forgiveness must be earned, but true forgiveness, the kind that changes a person from the inside out, can only be received, and you can't receive what you think you don't deserve. So they stay in the shadows, they sabotage relationships, they repeat the cycle of destruction, not because they're monsters, but because they believe they're too far gone. But no one is too far gone, not if they're willing to admit the truth. Shame and guilt are not proof that you're lost. They are the first signs that you are waking up. So when they rise, don't run, face them, let them break you, and then let that brokenness be the beginning of something new. Because grace doesn't come to the proud, it comes to the humbled, and the humbled are often the ones who've fallen the furthest, and cried the longest, and believed for years they didn't qualify, but they do, they always did. There are wounds in every human soul, deep ones, ancient ones. Some come from what others did to us, some come from what we did to ourselves, and most of them we've buried. We learn to walk around them, to build stories that explain them away, to armor ourselves against the pain. But no matter how deep you bury the wound, it doesn't disappear, it festers, it leaks into your behavior, your relationships, your habits, your dreams, and one day you wake up, and you don't recognize who you've become. That's the cost of refusing to confront what's inside you. People avoid pain for a reason. It's not irrational. Pain is overwhelming. Pain terrifies. And the wounds we carry, especially the hidden ones, are wrapped in memory, in shame, in betrayal. To face them is to relive them. To dig them up is to risk being undone. But here's the paradox. If you don't face them, they own you. Not consciously, perhaps, but silently, subtly, relentlessly. You become a slave to what you refuse to acknowledge. You see this everywhere. A man grows up with a father who never said, "I'm proud of you," and for the next 40 years, he tries to prove himself, exhausting his soul in the process. A woman is abandoned by someone she trusted, and from that moment forward she pushes people away before they can get too close. A child is told they're stupid, worthless, too much or not enough, and that voice becomes the narrative they repeat to themselves for the rest of their life. These aren't just stories, they're wounds, and they bleed into everything until they're confronted. Confronting your wounds isn't about blaming others. It's not about building a list of grievances or wallowing in self-pity. It's about truth. It's about looking squarely at what broke you and telling the truth about it, especially to yourself. Because truth, as difficult as it may be, is the only thing that liberates. If you lie to yourself about where the pain comes from, you'll try to fix the wrong things. You'll seek validation in the wrong places. You'll punish the innocent, or worse, you'll punish yourself. Many people live in a state of quiet torment. They sabotage opportunities. They lash out at those who love them. They numb themselves with distraction, addiction, achievement, anything to avoid the confrontation that must eventually come. But avoidance only feeds the wound. It gives it power. It lets it grow in the dark. And the longer you wait, the deeper it digs into your identity. You can't become whole by pretending the broken parts are there. You can't be free by denying the chains. And you certainly can't heal what you refuse to touch. Real transformation begins at the point of greatest pain. That's why people often resist healing. It costs something. It requires that you go back into the fire, not to be burned again, but to finally walk through it with your eyes open. That's courage. That's what it means to grow. Not to forget the pain, but to understand it, integrate it, and let it make you wiser instead of bitter. When you confront your hidden wounds, you begin to understand the patterns that govern your life. You start to see why you react the way you do, why certain words trigger you, why intimacy terrifies you, why you can't trust, why you can't rest, why you keep running from place to place, looking for peace and never finding it. You start to recognize that much of what you thought was just how you are, is actually a defense, a survival mechanism. built around an old injury. And once you see that, you can start to tear it down, piece by piece. This work is not easy, it's not glamorous, and it won't be applauded but it is sacred. To face what hurt you without letting it define you, that is the essence of courage. That is the road to freedom, and no one can walk it for you. It's a solitary path, but you're not alone, because the truth, once you face it, has a power all its own. And that truth, if you let it, will remake you. The wound is not your identity, but confronting it is your responsibility. You didn't choose to be hurt, but you do have to choose what to do with the pain now. And the only way forward is through, not around it, not above it, through. We live in a world obsessed with image. Everything is about appearance, how you're perceived, what people think of you, how clean your record looks, how inspiring your profile appears. The currency of modern life is perception, and so we become masters of performance. We learn how to curate a version of ourselves that looks good, that sounds good, that plays well in public. But the truth, the raw, unfiltered, bleeding truth gets better. It's pushed beneath the surface, hidden under layers of image and presentation. And the tragedy is, while the world may applaud the image, God sees only how spiritual change doesn't begin with image. It doesn't begin with a polished law, or a good reputation, or a facade of holiness. It begins always with honesty, brutal, unflinching, the kind that strips away every illusion, every excuse, every carefully constructed net. Because until you're willing to admit what's really there, what's broken, what's twisted, what's rotting inside, you can't change. You can only pretend. And pretending is the enemy of transformation. People spend years, even decades, trying to fix their lives externally. They go to church, they join groups, they read the right books, they say the right thing, that internally, they're still enslaved, they're still angry, still bitter, still filled with jealousy, lust, self-loathing, and they wonder why nothing ever really changed, why they still feel hollow, ashamed, disconnected. It's because the root hasn't been touched. The image has improved, but the soul remains hidden. You can lie to others, you can lie to yourself, but you cannot lie to the divine. God does not deal in public relations. He does not operate through He doesn't. It speaks to what's real, and what's real is often ugly, often confused, often, but it is real, and that's what He's after. Because God cannot redeem who you pretend to be. He can only redeem who you truly are. Honesty is painful. It requires that you admit things you'd rather keep in the dark. Forces you to say, I don't have it together. I've failed. I've been dishonest. I've hurt people. I've betrayed my values. I'm not who I pretend to be. That kind of confession doesn't win applause. It won't get you celebrated, but it will get you free. Because the moment you name the darkness begins to lose its power. There's a reason confession is so central to spiritual transformation. It's not about humility. It's about alignment with truth. And where there is truth, there is room for grace. But as you're invested in protecting you, grace has no place to lie. You can't be forgiven for sins you won't admit. You can't be healed from wounds you won't expose. And you can't be transformed into something new until you stop clinging to who you pretend to be. Image is seductive. It gives you control. It lets you manipulate how you see, but it isolates. It lets you trapped in your own path, terrified that someone will see through the crack. Honesty, on the other hand, is risky. It feels like death, but it's the only way to truly. Because once the mask comes up, once the secrets are spoken, once the truth is told, then and only then can something deeper happen. Then God can begin His work, not on the costume, but on the soul. Spiritual growth isn't about becoming it's about becoming real. That's why the people who change most profoundly are often the ones who hit rock bottom, who've lost the ability to who've been exposed and humiliated, and who in the decided to stop lying. That is the birthplace of spiritual awakening, not not success, honesty. So many are afraid that if they tell the truth about who they are, they'll be rejected by God, by the even the Father. But the is The moment you speak the truth, you create space for real connection, real forgiveness, real healing. Not everyone will accept, not everyone will stay, but the ones who matter, the ones who love what's real, will, and more importantly, God will meet you. There's not at the polished altar of your performance, but in the quiet, shattered space of honesty. The most powerful spiritual transformations begin when someone stops pretending, when they drop the actor, when they stop playing a role and start telling it. That's when the light breaks in. That's when the light breaks in. That's when the soul breathes again. And that's when the real journey begins. There's a dangerous lie that has crept into the minds of many, that the church is a place for the good people, that it's a club for the morally successful, the spiritually clean, the well put together. You walk into a sanctuary, and sometimes it feels like everyone is wearing a mask, smiling, polished, pretending. And if you're haunted by mistakes, if you've got questions or anger or shame, close it. You feel like an outsider, like you don't belong. But that is not what the church was ever meant to be. The church is not for the sick. It is for the sick. It is a place. It is a place where the broken come to bleed and be, not where the flawless come to perform. It is a hospital. It's a hospital, not a museum, a battlefield, not a ballroom. And if the church forgets that, if it becomes a theater for virtue signaling and public appearances, it loses its power, because the raw, redemptive, life-altering presence of the divine doesn't dwell in image, it dwells in truth. And the truth is that every person walking through those doors is carrying something heavy. Just hide it better than all. When Jesus walked the road, he didn't surround himself with the righteous. He sat with tax collectors, prostitutes, lepers, thieves, the outcasts, the shamed, the despised. He didn't avoid the mess. He stepped directly into it. He didn't say, clean yourself up and then come follow me. He said, come as you are. And when the religious leaders looked down on the broken, when they scoffed and judged and condemned, he rebuked them, not because they had high standards, but because they lacked compassion. They didn't understand that grace was never meant to be. It was meant to be given, freely, recklessly, to those who know that they need it. Suffering is not a disqualification from the presence of God. It's the prerequisite. If you're not suffering in some way, you're probably not paying attention. Life is suffering, and the church should be the one place in the world where you can walk in with your pain, your doubt, your addiction, your despair. Not be met with condemnation, but with compassion. Not with judgment, but with understanding, because the church doesn't exist to celebrate the perfect. It exists to walk beside the wounded. And that means it must be a place where honesty is welcome, where weakness is safe, where you don't have to pretend. But that's hard, because we want to look strong, we want to fit in, we're afraid of being exposed, so we hide, we put on the smile, the suit, the spiritual language, and we die slowly inside. And then we wonder why nothing changes, why we still feel alone, why our faith feels hollow. It's because we've turned the church into a state instead of a sanctuary. And until we close that, until we remember that it's the broken who belong most, we will continue to drive the suffering away. Some of the most powerful people in history were not clean, righteous men. They were sinners who had the courage to be honest. David the adulterer and murderer, Paul the persecutor of the church, Peter the denier. These were not saints when they were called. They were men with blood on their hands and guilt in their hearts. But they met God in the ashes of their failure, not in the perfection of their public image. If you're suffering, if you feel unworthy, if you've made a mess of your life and don't know where to turn, then you are exactly the kind of Paul, the church, not the version of you that's cleaned up and present, the real you, the one that wakes up at 2 a.m. and stares at the ceiling, full of regret, the one that doubts whether anyone could live here. If we really knew the truth, that's who belongs, that's who belongs. The church would welcome with open arms, not because your suffering makes you special, but because it makes you human. And that's what the church is for. Humans, struggling, aching, sinful humans who are trying to find their way. And maybe, just maybe, if we can strip away the performance and return
to the core, to humility, to honesty, to compassion. The church can be what it was always meant to be, not a monument to the righteous, but a refuge for the weary. We all want change, deep, lasting, meaningful transformation. We want to become better versions of ourselves. We want to break soul, heal wounds, leave behind destructive habits, and step into something new. But most people try to do this while holding on to control. They want transformation on their terms. They want to fix a mess without admitting they're broken. They want renewal without death. But that's not how it works. You cannot be transformed unless you first surrender. Surrender is not a passive act. It's not weakness. It's not giving up in despair. It is one of the most difficult, courageous and defiant things a person can do. It's looking in the mirror and saying, I cannot fix this alone. I've tried everything. I've manipulated, controlled, performed, pretended, and it's still broken. I am still broken. That moment, raw, exposed, without defense, is the doorway to because only what's placed in the only what's placed in the hands of something greater can be made new. Most people spend their lives resisting surrender. They grip tighter when things fall apart. They build higher walls. They hustle harder. They stop the pain, silence the doubt, polish the image. But deep down, they're terrified. Terrified that if they stop controlling, everything will collapse. That if they let go, they'll lose themselves. But here's the truth. You are not losing yourself by surrendering. You are finally allowing yourself to be remade. To surrender is to trust that something beyond your limited strength and intellect is working in you. It is to say, I don't know how to heal this wound. I don't know how to carry this grief. I don't know how to stop the anger, the addiction, the shame. But I'm pretending I can do it all on my own. That is the ground where transformation happens. Not in strength, but in surrender. Not in the illusion of control, but in the acceptance of reality. You can't transform what you're still trying to manage. You can't heal what you're still hurt. You can't be free from what you continue to say. And many people never change because they're not willing to lay it down, to surrender the bitterness, the need to be right, the need to be in control. They cling to the very things that are destroying them. They'd rather suffer in the known than risk the unknown. But surrender isn't about loss. It's about trading something lesser for something greater. You cannot hold on to your ego and expect to grow. You cannot serve two masters. You cannot say, I want to be made new, while clinging to the old. Transformation requires death. The death of the false self, the constructed self, the image you've worked so hard to protect. And death in any form is painful. That's why people avoid it. But on the other side of that, death is resurrection. That's the pattern. Death then life, not the other way around. There is no shortcut. Think about it. Every meaningful transformation in life begins with a letting go, a surrender. The addict doesn't recover until he says, I'm powerless. The betrayed person doesn't heal until she says, I can't carry this anger anymore. The fearful man doesn't grow until he says, I'm willing to step into the unknown. That's what surrender looks like. It's not about apathy. It's not about apathy. It's about release. It's not the end of effort. It's the beginning of right effort. And in the spiritual sense, surrender is everything. You can study doctrine, read sacred texts, attend services, and speak the right words. But if your heart is still clenched, if you're still fighting, then nothing changes. The divine doesn't force transformation. It invites it. And the invitation always comes in the same lay it down. Your wounds, your rights, your fears, your lay them down. Not because you're worthless, but because you're loved. Loved enough to be changed. Transformation is not about achieving a new identity. It's about uncovering the true one, buried under years of trauma, performance, and fear. And that uncovering, that unveiling, can only happen when you stop pretending, stop striving, stop resisting, and surrender. When you finally surrender, the weight begins to lift, the chains begin to break. Not all at once, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, but something shifts. And in that shift, there's space. space for truth, space for healing, space for grace. That space is where the real work begins, not through effort alone, but through trust, through yielding, through letting go, so that something greater can take over. Thank you.